Good day, class. Welcome to part two of chapter four, extinguishment of obligations. So we have already tackled payment or performance as the first mode of extinguishment of obligations. We shall now be tackling the rest of the modes of extinguishment of obligations. So first, we have loss of the thing due. It's covered under Article 1262 of the Civil Code of the Philippines. So let's begin. So when is a thing considered lost? It is lost when it perishes or goes out of commerce or disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown or it cannot be recovered. All right. Let's say something fell to the sea. You're not sure if it's lost, right? Because you can attempt to recover it. But if it's under circumstances as if it cannot be recovered, then it's considered lost already. Kung sa mababaw lang na natapon, pwede yung pakunin yun. Pero pag sa malalim na, you will not be able to, or maybe you can. Using an infinite number of resources, you can still recover the thing. But normally, you wouldn't be able to recover that. So that is considered lost. So when loss of the thing will extinguish an obligation to give, number one, when the obligation is to deliver a specific or determinate thing. Now, this is very important, class. All right? If your obligation is to deliver a generic thing, okay? Generic things, they never perish. What's a good example of a generic thing? Money, right? Money is always generic. Okay. Let's say you're on your way to the bank, right? Tapos for some reason nawala yung pera mo because let's say na-hold up ka or na-pickpocket ka, you are still liable to pay. All right? Number two, the loss of the thing occurs without the fault of the debtor. This is important. Number three, the debtor is not guilty of delay. Right? Is it just ordinary delay? No. It should be legal delay. Remember this class, right? Remember the general rule, no demand, no delay. Okay? So kung ordinary delay lang, all right, the debtor is still not guilty of delay kapag ordinary delay lang. When is the debtor considered in delay? If there is demand already made by the creditor. Unless, of course, it falls under certain exceptions, which we discussed in the prior video. When loss of the thing will not extinguish liability, number one, when the law so provides, such as those guilty of fraud, negligence, or delay. Remember this class, no? Those guilty of fraud, negligence, or delay. Loss of generic things, promising to deliver the same thing to two or more persons who do not have the same interest. Number two, when the stipulation so provides, the parties can actually stipulate on this. The debtor will still be liable even in case of loss, but it has to be agreed upon by the parties. Number three, when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. Number four, when the obligation to deliver a specific thing arises from a crime. So what is the effect of impossibility of performance? When without the debtor's fault, the obligation becomes legally or physically impossible. It will result to extinction of the obligation. Impossibility must take place after the constitution of the obligation. If the obligation is impossible from the very beginning, the obligation is void, right? Kung sa simula pa lang, impossible na yung obligation, the obligation is void. Okay? So, anong example nito? When the artist painter gets his arms amputated after an accident. So, kumbaga sa una pa lang, yung obligation na yon is valid because the painter could easily paint. The obligation of the painter was to paint. And let's say na-accident siya without his fault. Naputol yung kamay niya. and the obligation is impossible already. What is the effect of difficulty of performance? When the performance of the service has become so difficult as to be manifestly beyond the contemplation of both parties, the court is authorized to release the debtor in whole or in part. All right. Take a note of this class. No, it is the court. It is the court's discretion if the court will release the debtor in whole or in part in case of difficulty of performance. Hindi pwedeng yung debtor magsasabi, teka, hirap nito gawin. No? Baka pwedeng ma-release na ako sa obligation na to. Hindi pwedeng gano'n. Pwede kapag payag yung creditor. No? Pero kapag hindi, the parties can go to court. The court will determine the extent of difficulty of performance. It applies to both real and personal obligations. Example, when the contractor cannot continue the construction of the road because of heavy avalanche in the said area. All right. So the court will determine if the debtor shall be released from liability. Kasi kung tinatamad lang yung debtor, kasi if we allow the debtor to use as an example difficulty to use as an excuse the difficulty of performance to excuse him from fulfilling his obligation, edi lahat na lang ng dahilan ginamit niya. Kasi wala siyang gasolina, kasi wala siyang, hindi pwedeng ganun. Correct? So it should be the court that will determine the extent of difficulty of performance. The creditor has a right to go against third persons who caused the loss. If a third person caused the loss without the fault or connivance of the debtor, the obligation is extinguished. Alright? Kasi hindi naman kasalanan ng debtor na nagkaroon ng loss. However, the creditor can proceed against the third person who caused the loss. Yung third person, yung pwedeng habulin ng creditor who caused the loss. Example, S is obliged to deliver a specific carabao to B. The carabao is lost through the fault of T. T is a third person. The obligation of S is extinguished and he is not liable to B anymore because the carabao is lost. B can then go after the one who caused the loss, T. All right. So let's go to the next mode of extinguishment, which is condonation. All right, so under Article 1270, condonation or remission is essentially gratuitous. So we know what gratuitous is, right? Free, libre. And requires the acceptance by the obligor. Dapat pumayag dito yung debtor or yung obligor before magkaroon ng condonation. Bakit? Kasi ayaw natin na magkaroon ng utang na loob. No? It may be made expressly or impliedly. One and the other kind shall be subject to the rules which shall govern inofficious donations. Express condonation shall furthermore comply with the forms of donation. What is condonation or remission? It is gratuitous abandonment by the creditor of his right against the debtor. So parang parang nililibre na ng creditor yung obligation ni debtor. It is a form of donation. There must be acceptance by the debtor. Alright? Importante ito class, no? There must be acceptance by the debtor na pinapawalang sala na siya, na nililibre na yung utang niya, yung obligation niya. Okay? Kahit sa donation class, no? You cannot just donate to anybody. Hindi mo pwede, sa'yo na lang to, pak, ganyan. Paano kung ayaw na tanggapin, pipilitin mo? Hindi pwede. Alright? Baka sabihin nyo, ikaw na nga binibigyan, ayaw mo pa. Ganun talaga. So the donee, there must be acceptance by the donee before you can donate. There must be acceptance by the person you want to donate to. Hindi pwedeng basta magbibigay ka na lang. So yan class, no? There must be acceptance by the debtor. So what are the requisites of condonation or remission? Number one, it must be gratuitous. Dapat walang kapalit. No? It must be accepted by the obligor. The parties must have capacity. Ibig sabihin ng capacity. dapat hindi incapacitated, no? At saka dapat tama lang yung amount. Dito sa number 4. It must not be inefficacious. It must not be too much. No one can give more than what he can give by will. If the donation is too much, it can be reduced by courts. Alright? Hindi pwedeng masyadong malaki. Well, syempre, class, it depends on the circumstances of the donor. Alright? Kasi paano kung i-donate niya is already 99% of his properties. Hindi pwedeng wala siyang ititira sa sarili niya. Okay? Bakit ganun, class? No? Bakit may hiyalamang court dito? Paano kung gusto niya ibigay ang lahat? Ganyan. Hindi pwede. Because if you give all of your properties away, edi ikaw naman yung naghihirap. Parang ganun. Alright? So, it should not be inefficacious. If made expressly, it must comply with the forms of donations. So the next mode of extinguishment is confusion or merger of rights. We hear about confusion all the time. Confusion means nalilito, right? Now, so here the obligation is extinguished from the time the characters of creditor and debtor are merged in the same person. Okay? So maraming examples to, class, no? So anyway, confusion or merger of rights. So the characters of creditor and debtor are merged in the same person. So isang tao na lang yung debtor at saka creditor. Nangyayari ba yan? Yes, nangyayari yan. So meaning of confusion or merger, meeting in one person of the qualities of creditor and debtor with respect to the same obligation. So reasons of confusion: if a debtor is his own creditor, the enforcement of the obligation becomes absurd since a person cannot pay payment from himself, right? Kumbaga ikaw na yung debtor at saka creditor, nasa iyo na yung credit, nasa iyo rin yung obligation. Sisingilin mo ba yung sarili mo? That is absurd. The purposes for which the obligation may have been created are deemed realized. The requisites: it must take place between the principal debt and the creditor. It must be complete. Okay? For example, D owes C 100,000 pesos, for which D executed a negotiable promissory note in favor of C. Alright? So, himayin natin to, class. So, si D may utang kay C na 100,000 pesos, evidenced by a promissory note. Ang promissory note, pwede mo yan pagpasahan, no? Sinasabi kasi sa promissory note, I promise to pay the bearer of this note, assuming it's a bearer instrument, 100,000 pesos. Right? Isabihin ko, sino may hawak ng note na yon? Pwede niyang singilin si D. Ang nakapirma doon sa promissory note, si D. Okay? So yung note na yon, hawak ni C. Ang hawak ni C yung note. Alright? Ang nakapirma doon sa note, si D, kasi siya yung gumawa ng promissory note. Siya yung maker. Alright? So si C yung may hawak ng promissory note. Ang ginawa ni C, in-endorse niya kay E. Bakit in-endorse kay E? Siguro may binili siyang gamit worth 100,000 pesos. Ngayon, walang pera that time si C. So ang ginawa niya, sabi niya kay E, E, meron akong promissory note from D. So pwede mo sa kanya singilin yung 100,000 pesos. Pwede ba 'yon? Yes, pwede 'yon. Assuming na pumayag si E, ha? So E in turn endorsed it to F. So yung promissory note naman na kay F na. Siguro kasi si E may biniling gamit kay F. Ngayon naman si F may binili sa store ni D. Okay? So instead of paying cash, F endorsed the promissory note to D. So you get the trail, class? Bumalik kay D yung promissory note niya. Okay? So si F kasi may biniling gamit daw kay D. So imbes na magbayad ng cash si D kay F, yung promissory note na lang binigay niya kay D. In this case, D now owes himself. Consequently, the obligation is extinguished by merger. So ito yung sabihin ng confusion or merger of rights. Okay? So hawak ni D yung sarili niyang promissory note. Okay, wala siyang nilabas na pera. Okay? Wala siyang nilabas na pera kay C. Alright? Sabi nga dito, DOC 100,000 pesos, siguro umutang siya kay C. No? Kasi ang ginawa niya promissory note. Ngayon yung promissory note, ang ina-expect niya merong magbibigay sa kanya nito para bayaran niya. Nangyari, ang nagbigay sa kanya si F. Si F kasi bumili ng mga gamit sa kanya. So actually si F dapat yung may utang sa kanya. Alright? F is supposed to pay D 100,000 pesos. Pero imbis na ginawa ni F yun, binigay yung promissory note which D accepted. Okay? So magbabayad ba si D sa sarili niya? O D, ito yung 100,000 pesos. O D ulit, natanggap ka niya yung 100,000 pesos. That is absurd. Alright? Wala na kailangan exchange of cash. Alright? So effect of merger in the person of principal debtor or creditor. Merger in the person of the principal debtor or creditor extinguishes the obligation. The accessory obligation of guarantee is also extinguished in accordance with the principle. The accessory follows the principal. Example, D is indebted to C with G as guarantor. You know what a guarantor is, class, right? Pag hindi nakabayad yung debtor, the guarantor will pay the creditor, right? The merger of the characters of debtor and creditor in D shall free G from liability as guarantor. Kasi yun nga, the accessory follows the principal. Similarly, merger which takes place in the person of C benefits G because the extinction of the principal obligation carries with it that of the accessory obligation of guarantee. All right? The effect of merger in the person of the guarantor. Yan naman iba treatment ito. Extinguishment of the accessory obligation does not carry with it that of the principal obligation because the principal does not follow the accessory. It will only extinguish the guarantee while the obligation remains intact. The principal does not follow the accessory. Example, D is indebted to C with G as guarantor. C assigns his credit to E, who in turn assigns the credit to G, the guarantor. In this case, only the contract of guarantee is extinguished. D's obligation to pay C still subsists. Okay? So nandiyan pa rin yung principal obligation. Babayaran pa rin ni D si C. Okay? Pero hindi na guarantor si G. G is already released from potential liability. Okay? So assuming hindi magbayad si D, hindi pwedeng habulin ni C si G, yung guarantor. Kasi nagkaroon na ng merger in the person of the guarantor. Let's go to the next mode of extinguishment, which is compensation. Right? So compensation shall take place when two persons in their own right are creditors and debtors of each other. Nakakalito ba to? What's the difference between compensation and confusion? Confusion, isang tao. Alright? Isang tao, debtor and creditor siya. Okay? Dito sa compensation, so merong debtor at saka merong creditor, pareho silang may utang sa isa't isa. Alright? Sa confusion, isang tao lang, tapos debtor siya and creditor siya, all by himself. Alright? Kasi bumalik sa kanya yung credit niya. Kaya na example natin kanina. Okay? I mean, bumalik sa kanya yung obligation niya. Kaya na example natin kanina. Meaning of compensation. Extinguishment to the concurrent amount of the debts of two persons who in their own right are debtors and creditors of each other. Examples. A owes B the amount of 1,000 pesos. B owes A the amount of 700 pesos. Both debts are due and payable today. There is partial compensation to the concurrent amount of 700 pesos. A shall be liable to B for only 300 pesos. Okay? Nag-compensate na class, no? Pero partially lang. May natitira pang utang na 300 pesos. Pero hindi kailangan na magbayad muna si A ng 1,000 pesos, tapos si B naman, magbabayad din ng 700 pesos. Pwede mag-offset na lang. Alright? Number 2, A owes B the amount of 1,000 pesos. B owes A the amount of 1,000 pesos. There is total compensation. The two debts are extinguished without actual transfer of money between the parties. Alright? Kung magbabayaran pa sila, kung magkakasuhan pa sila ng ganyan, it's already a joke. And it's also a waste of time. What is the object of compensation? To prevent unnecessary litigations and payments. Alright? Mutual extinguishment by operation of law of concurring debts of two persons. So parang hindi na kailangan magkita pa or what? So it is already compensated by operation of law. The parties are principal creditors and principal debtors of each other. Example, A owes B 1,000 while B owes A 1,000. In this case, compensation will take place because A and B are principal debtors and creditors of each other. Second example, A owes B 1,000 pesos with C as guarantor. B owes C 1,000 pesos. In this case, there can be no compensation between B and C because C is merely subsidiarily liable to B. Alright? C can still demand payment from B. Alright? Kasi dapat kasi ang principal creditors and principal debtors of each other yung debtor at saka creditor. Okay? Hindi yung guarantor because ang guarantor subsidiarily liable lang. Bakit tinatawag na subsidiarily liable lang yung guarantor? Because it becomes liable only if the debtor does not pay. Both debts consist in a sum of money or of consumable things of the same kind and quality. So class, importante yung same kind and quality. First example, A owes B 1,000 pesos while B owes A an electric range worth 1,000 pesos. In this case, no compensation will take place. Kasi yung isa pera daw, tapos yung isa para appliance. Hindi pwede magkaroon ng compensation dyan. Pwede sila magsingilan sa isa't isa. Alright? Because the debts are not of the same kind and quality. Example. Second example, A owes B 10 sacks of mayo rice. B owes A any 10 sacks of any kind of rice. Nasulat dito, any kind. No compensation pa rin. Because they must be of the same kind and quality. Alright? Kasi kung mayo rice din, yung obligation ni B kay A, then the obligation is extinguished by reason of compensation. But in this case, dahil magkaiba, hindi pwede. So when is legal compensation not allowed? Where one of the debts arises from a depositum. What is a contract of deposit, class? Is it exactly the same? Is it the same contract that you have when you deposit in a bank? Let's say you deposit you deposit money in a bank. Is it a contract of deposit? Not exactly, class. All right? Because the purpose ng deposit is really for safekeeping. Okay? Yung pera na dinadeposit niyo sa bank, it's not deposit per se. Because the bank actually uses your money to invest and to lend money to borrowers. Okay? Saka pati nagkakaroon kayo ng interest in your bank deposits. But the contract of deposit, let's say ito, hindi mo pinapahiram yung gamit. Parang you're giving the thing to the person only for safekeeping. So saan nyo makikita, saan nyo na-experience ang contract of deposit? Let's say you go to a mall, tapos sinusurrender niyo yung bag nyo kasi bawal pumasok sa grocery o sa supermarket na may bag. So you deposit your bag to the depositary. Alright? Tapos yung depositary has to take care of your belongings. So it's there for safekeeping. Alright? So deposit where a person receives a thing belonging to another with the obligation of safely keeping it and of returning the same. It is fiduciary in character. It's based on trust and confidence. So kailangan ng tiwala when you make a contract of deposit. So it's a facultative compensation. Only the depositor may claim the compensation but not the other party. So ikaw na nag-deposit ng thing, pwede ka mag-claim ng compensation. Pero yung pinag-depositohan mo, hindi siya pwede mag-claim ng compensation pag nawala niya. So parang ganun. No? So example, A owes B 10,000 pesos. B in turn owes A the amount of 10,000 pesos, representing the value of a ring deposited by A with B, which B failed to return. B as depositary cannot claim compensation, but A can claim if A wants to do so. Alright? So yung pinagdepositohan mo, hindi pwedeng hindi pwedeng, let's say nawala niya or ginamit niya or what. Hindi na pwedeng sabihin, dahil may utang ka sa akin, so tabla na. So wala ka ng utang sa akin. No? Hindi pwede yan, class. Alright? Pero kung ikaw naman, let's say ang deposit mo bag worth 1,000 pesos. Okay? I-deposit mo sa dun sa SM for easy reference. Okay? So let's say may utang ka sa SM na 1,000 pesos. Okay? Tapos dineposit mo yung bag mo sa SM, yung bag mo is worth 1,000 pesos. Alright? Tapos let's say gusto mo ma-compensate na. Let's say ayaw mo na makautang. Pwede niyo pag-usapan na, sige kung payag ka, ikaw pwede mag-bring up, no? Pwede mo sabihin na, wala na akong utang sa'yo, tapos sa'yo na lang yung bag ko. Of course, that person also has to agree. Alright? Pag hindi siya agree, hindi pwede. Okay? Pero balik rin natin. Let's say, nag-deposit ka ng bag mo, may utang ka, 1,000 pesos sa depositary sa SM. Tapos yung SM, nawala yung bag mo because, let's say, SM was careless. SM was careless, no? Hindi na pwedeng sabihin na, teka, may utang ka naman sa amin. So, offset na lang natin. Hindi pwedeng ganun. Alright? SM, the depositary will be liable to you, the depositor, for the lost item. Okay? So, hindi pwede dito ang legal compensation. Legal compensation means nagkakaroon ng compensation whether the parties like it or not. Okay? When is legal compensation also not allowed? Number 2, where one of the debts arises from a comodatum. What is a comodatum? A comodatum, you encounter this all the time. Right? Lalo na pag mahilig ka humiram ng gamit na may gamit. Let's say hiniram mo yung bike, hiniram mo yung kotse. Okay? Nagbabayad ka ba para humiram? Hindi. Alright? You're using the bike for your own use. Or you're using the car. Let's say gusto mo hiramin yung kotse sa kaibigan mo, sa kapatid mo. You are entering into a contract of comodatum. Pwede rin libro. Anything you can think of na pwede mo gamitin. Okay? So, comodatum, it is a gratuitous contract. Kasi let's say, pinahiram mo let's say, binigay mo yung kotse mo, tapos naniningil ka, that's not a contract of comodatum. That's a contract of lease. Pinaparentahan mo pala yung kotse mo. Pero ang comodatum, pinapagamit mo na libre. It's a gratuitous contract whereby one of the parties delivers something not consumable to another party for the latter's use for a certain amount of time. It is fiduciary in character because it is based on trust and confidence. So yun ang fiduciary, no? So merong trust and confidence. It's also a facultative compensation. Only the bailor may claim the compensation but not the bailee. Teka muna, sino ba ang bailor? Ang bailor, yung nagpahiram. Okay? Ang bailee, yung humiram, yung gumagamit ng gamit niya yun. Alright? So example, A owes B 10,000 pesos. B in turn borrowed from A ring worth 10,000 pesos. Ibahin natin kanina, yung kanina, dineposit. So pag dineposit, hindi pwede gamitin. For safekeeping lang. Okay? Pero dito sa comodatum, pwede gamitin. Pwede gamitin yung ring. B as bailee cannot set up compensation as against A and refuse to return the ring. Only A can assert compensation. So yung parang kanina. So number 3, when legal compensation is not allowed, where one of the debts arises from a claim for support due by a gratuitous title. Example, B is the father of a minor, who under the law is entitled to be supported by B. All right? Parents are supposed to take care of their children when they're minors. Okay? Now, A owes B 5,000 pesos. Kasi umutang yung anak sa parents. B cannot compensate his obligation to support A by what A owes him. Hindi pwedeng sabihin ng let's say magbabayad ng tuition or magbabayad ng pagkain or what. Hindi pwedeng sabihin ng magulang o anak, dahil may utang ka sa akin, hindi na kita susuportahan. Hindi pwedeng gano'n. The parents are obliged to support their minor children. Okay? So kahit may utang sa kanila, hindi pwedeng magkaroon ng compensation doon. The right to receive support cannot be compensated because it is essential to the life of the recipient. Okay? Number 4, where one of the debts consists in civil liability arising from a penal offense, galing sa crime. The satisfaction of the obligation is imperative. Kailangan. Example, D owes C 10,000 pesos. C stole the ring of D worth 10,000 pesos. In this case, compensation by C is not proper. However, D may claim compensation. So mga one-sided, no, kung napapansin nyo. Alright? Hindi pwede sabihin nung nagnakaw, o teka, dahil may utang ka sa akin, wala na akong utang sa'yo. Hindi na kita babayaran kahit kinakaw ko pa yung singsing. Hindi pwedeng gano'n. Alright? So consent of the parties is not required in legal compensation. Compensation takes place automatically by operation of law. Full legal capacity of parties is not required. Now let's go to novation tax. This is the last mode of extinguishment of obligations. So obligations may be modified by changing their object or principal obligations. Number 2, substituting the person of the debtor. Number 3, subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Right? So dito class, mapansin nyo, either nagbabago yung thing itself, yung object, or nagbabago yung debtor o kaya yung creditor. So nagkakaroon ng novation. What is the word novation? The word novation, what is the root word here? It's new, right? New. Novation. Parang binabago yung contract. Of course, this requires the consent of the parties. For some exceptions. The meaning of novation: total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of a new one which substitutes it. Requisites of novation: previous and valid obligation. So class, take note, no? So sinasabi dito dapat the old obligation has to be valid. Or pwede ring voidable because voidable contracts are valid until they are annulled. Okay? If it's a void obligation, there can be no novation. There can be no novation of a void obligation because a void obligation is void ab initio from the very start. Hindi pwedeng palitan yan. Number 2, capacity and intention of the parties to modify or extinguish the obligation. Number 3, the modification or extinguishment of the obligation. Number 4, the creation of a new valid obligation. So it is important to note, class, that novation is not presumed. Okay? Hindi pwedeng i-assume na lang na mayroong novation na nangyayari. Okay? It must be clearly and unmistakably established by express agreement or acts of equivalent import or by the incompatibility of the two obligations with each other in every material aspect. Okay? Example, S agreed to deliver to B a car on November 10. Subsequently, a second agreement was entered into whereby S would deliver a truck on November 10. Is there novation in this case? There is no novation. There is no declaration and there is no incompatibility. Okay? So ang obligation ni S ay mag-deliver ng car at saka ng truck. Alright? Kasi wala namang sinasabi na instead of delivering a car, S would deliver a truck instead. Walang ganun pinag-usapan. So kung walang ganun pinag-usapan, alright, ibig sabihin, walang novation. Kaya mahirap ang implied novation class. No? You have to really know the intention of the parties. And you have to look at the circumstances of each case to determine whether or not there is novation. Second example, S agreed to construct a house on a 30 square meter land. Subsequently, S agreed to construct an apartment on the same parcel of land. They cannot be constructed on the same site. There is novation because the two obligations are incompatible. Alright? Dito mo lang malalaman kung merong implied novation class if the two obligations are incompatible. Ang sinasabi dito sa example, isa lang yung parcel of land. 30 square meters is very small. No, very, very small ang 30 square meters. You cannot build a house and an apartment at the same time. Pipili ka lang ng isa. That's why it's incompatible. Dito sa first example, there's no incompatibility here. Ang labas nito, parang nadagdagan pa yung obligation ni S. Alright? So kinds of personal novation. We have substitution when the person of the debtor is substituted with the consent of the creditor. So class, take note. So when we talk of substitution, when the person of the debtor is changed, no, or substituted, it requires the consent of the creditor. Okay? Subrogation naman, when the third person is subrogated in the rights of the creditor. So ito, nagbabago naman yung creditor. No? So take note class, pag substitution, nagbabago yung debtor. Pag subrogation, nagbabago yung creditor. So take note, substitution, debtor. Subrogation, creditor. Okay? So what are the kinds of substitution? Again, ano ang substitution? Nagbabago yung debtor. Right? So the two kinds of substitution, number one, we have expromission. In expromission, the third person pays the debt without the knowledge or against the will of the debtor. So hindi alam ng debtor, binabayaran pala yung utang niya. Pwede ba yun? Yes, pwede yun. As long as there is consent by the creditor. It needs only consent of the creditor and the third person. There can only be beneficial reimbursement by the third person. Okay? So meaning class, no? So kapag nagbayad naman yung third person, pwede naman niya singilin yung pwede naman niya singilin yung debtor. Yung lumang debtor, okay? Pero paano kung hindi pala niya alam, no? Yung pala nagbayad na ng partial. Yung pala nagbayad na ng partial yung lumang debtor. Masisingil ba niya yung yung binayad na ng debtor dun sa debtor? Masisingil ba ng third person yung binayad ng debtor sa creditor? The answer is no. Kanina pwede masingil yung extra payment dun sa creditor. But that is his problem. Okay? In delegation class, the third person pays the debt at the insistence of the debtor provided the creditor agrees. All parties here must agree. Debtor, creditor, and third person. The new debtor is entitled to reimbursement and subrogation. Okay? So class dito, sa delegation, alam ng debtor na yung third person ang magbabayad ng utang niya. In this case, the third person, he sort of becomes the new creditor. Alright? So merong subrogation. So parang nagbabago din yung third person, siya na yung parang creditor niya yun. No? So kung yung creditor, kung meron siyang kung merong let's say merong guarantor, let's say merong mortgage, merong ganyan, napasa yung rights niya sa kanya, dun sa third person. Alright, class? Pero dito sa expromission, walang ganon. Kung merong mortgage, kung merong guarantor, etc., hindi yun masisingil nung third person. Okay? So yun yung difference ng expromission at saka delegation. So effect of new debtors insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation in expromission. In case of insolvency or non-fulfillment of the new debtor, the old debtor is not liable. Okay? So again, what is expropriation? Hindi alam ng debtor, hindi alam ng debtor na nagbayad yung third person. Right? So in case of insolvency or non-fulfillment of the new debtor, the old debtor is not liable. Now in delegation, what is the effect of the new debtor's insolvency? If so dalawa class, no? Dalawa kapag delegation. What is delegation? Delegation means alam ng debtor na magbabayad yung third person ng utang niya. That is delegation. So there are two cases here in delegation. Dito sa expropriation, there's only one scenario. The old debtor is not liable. Okay? Take note class, no? In expropriation, in case of insolvency or non-fulfillment by the new debtor, the old debtor is not liable. Dito naman sa delegation, alam ng debtor na magbabayad yung third person, there are two scenarios. In case of if the insolvency is already existing and known by the old debtor, sabihin alam nung debtor na insolvent talaga yung third person, alright? O kaya public knowledge na insolvent yung third person. Okay? Kahit hindi alam ng debtor, basta public knowledge siya, the old debtor is still liable. Okay? Sabihin hindi ma-release yung old debtor sa utang niya. Okay? If the insolvency is not known by the debtor and not of public knowledge, the old debtor is not liable. Okay? In case of non-fulfillment other than insolvency, the old debtor is not liable. Okay? So in case of insolvency, now, what is insolvency again? When is a person considered insolvent? When the assets are less than the liabilities. Okay? When the liabilities are more than the assets, a person is insolvent. What is the effect of novation on accessory obligations? When novation extinguishes a principal obligation, accessory obligations may subsist only insofar as they may benefit third persons who did not give their consent. It's an exception to the general rule that the accessory follows the principal. Example, A owes B 10,000 pesos with interest at 6%. B owes C 600 pesos. Right? It was agreed by the parties. So merong agreement class, no? That A, pati si C alam niya, no? It was agreed by the parties that A would pay the interest of 600 pesos to C. Because of this stipulation in favor of the third person, this said stipulation will subsist in spite of the novation. Right, class? So, sabihin, pwede pa rin magkaroon ng novation. But the liability to a third person is still there. Okay? So take note of this class, no? There's a stipulation in favor of a third person. Okay? So dapat hindi mawala yun. Dapat tuloy pa rin yun. So what is the effect? Where the new obligation is void, there is no novation if the new obligation is void. Okay? The old obligation, assuming it is valid, it shall subsist. Alright, class? So kapag void yung new obligation, walang novation. The old obligation shall still subsist. The exception is when the parties intended that the old obligation shall be extinguished in any event. In fact, where the old obligation is void. A void obligation cannot be novated, class. Okay? Because a void obligation is void ab initio. There can be no ratification whatsoever. So what is the meaning of subrogation? Substitution of one person in the place of a creditor with reference to a lawful claim or right, giving the former all the rights of the latter, including the right to employ all remedies to enforce payment. So that is a subrogation. Alright, so kumbaga yung bagong tao, alright, pwede niya ma-exercise yung sa mortgage, Pwede niya habulin yung mga guarantors, etc. Kung meron man. So kinds of subrogation, number one is conventional. Kapag pumayag yung mga, if there is an agreement by the parties. It's by express agreement of the parties. All the parties must agree. The debtor, the creditor, and third person. This is conventional subrogation. Ang legal subrogation naman, it takes place by operation of law. All right? And that is legal subrogation. Consent of all parties is required in conventional subrogation. Why? The debtor, kailangan meron consent niya because he becomes liable to a new creditor. Hindi siya pwede magkamali ng babayaran. The old creditor, because his right against the debtor is extinguished. The new creditor, because he may dislike or distrust the debtor. So cases of legal subrogation, number one, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred. So take note class, it's a creditor paying another creditor who is preferred. Example, A owes B 100,000 pesos secured by a first mortgage on the land of A. So merong security, no? Merong mortgage. A also owes C 200,000 pesos but is unsecured. Okay? So take note class, no? Si A, there's only one debtor, tapos he owes several parties. So may utang siya kay B, may utang siya kay C. Yung utang niya kay B, secured by a mortgage. Yung utang niya kay C, it's unsecured. If C pays the debt of A to B, C will be subrogated in B's right so that he can have the mortgage foreclosed in case A fails to pay the 100,000 pesos debt. Okay, so take note class, no? So so dito, pag binayaran ni nung isa pang creditor, yung isa pang creditor na preferred, pwede magkaroon ng subrogation dito. Alright, so meaning dahil merong kasi di ba binayaran niya yung utang kay binayaran niya si B, di ba? Binayaran niya si B. Ngayon naman, dahil binayaran niya si B, kanina kukunin yung bayad na yun. Kay A pa rin. Alright? Sisinganin pa rin niya yung debtor. But of course, yung mortgage, it will still subsist. Okay? So he can foreclose the property in case hindi magbayad si A ng 100,000 pesos na yun. Number two, when a third person without interest in the obligation pays with the approval of the debtor. Okay? Example, A owes B 100,000 pesos. C pays B with express or implied consent of A. C will be subrogated in the rights of B. Number three, when the third person with interest in the obligation pays even without the knowledge of the debtor. So yung sa number 3 class, no? A third person with interest in the obligation. So kahit hindi alam nung debtor, there's still legal subrogation. Example, A owes B 100,000 pesos with C as guarantor. If C pays B even without the knowledge of A, C is subrogated in the rights of B. Confusion or merger takes place in the person C, the guarantor, but the principal obligation still subsists. Okay? Okay, class, we end here. Keep safe, take care. God bless.